Welcome to the Star Chamber. I'm Ryan Swayze, a retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel and the founder and president of the Walk the Talk Foundation, a nonprofit that advocates for and advises currently serving and former military service members going through the arduous journey of administrative processes and investigations in our government.
And I am Francesca Graham, a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel and the Chief Operating Officer and Chief Advisor for the Walk the Talk Foundation. For all our returning guests, welcome back. And for our new listeners, thank you for tuning in. Before we begin this week's topic, please do not forget to hit that subscribe button, check out our Walk the Talk Foundation website, and hit that donate button if you think we're doing a good job. Also, check out our newsletter, the DoD Times Redacted, on all the socials, including LinkedIn, X, Instagram, and Facebook. Links in the description. All right, Star Chamber listeners, let's get started. Welcome back, Star Chamber listeners. Today we're going to talk about the Defense Attaché service scandal, which played out in the halls of the Defense Intelligence Agency from 2019 to 2022. Many people have asked us in the past what exactly happened in the agency and what prompted Ryan to go public as a whistleblower in 2022 to speak out against the wrongdoings occurring within the agency. And while we will delve into that, this episode is as much about the DIA scandal as it is about our failed avenues of redress in military and government. Our guest today, Chad Brooks, along with Ryan, will recount the events of those 5 years. But it is important to pay particular attention to all the agencies who purport themselves to be avenues through which a service member can seek redress, and literally all of them failed. DIA's military chain of command, multiple inspectors general, the Council of Inspectors General, or CIGIE, congressional members and staffers, the officers' individual services, and on and on and on. In this regard, Ryan and Chad's story, although perhaps different in size, scale, and depth, is strikingly similar to the journey of most every whistleblower in our uniformed services today. But before we get started, let me go ahead and just do a quick disclaimer for our guest, Lieutenant Colonel Chad Brooks from the United States Marine Corps. He is an active duty judge advocate, and he is a bit, once I read his bio, I think you'll all agree with me, that he's a bit of a Renaissance man. Before we get started, though, the opinions and views expressed by guests on this podcast are solely their own and do not represent the official policies, positions, or endorsements of the United States Marine Corps, the Department of Defense, or any other government entity. This discussion is intended for informational purposes only and should not be construed as reflecting the official stance of any military or governmental organization. Ryan?
Suck it, Poindexters.
Suck it, Poindexters. Damn right. Dang right. Every time, baby. If you all think we're not going to do that, you should
tune out.
You're going to
lose. Please don't tune out.
Don't tune out, dude. All right. So just a quick bio on Lieutenant Colonel Brooks, who I will call Chad moving forward. So he originates from Detroit, Michigan. He graduated from Western Michigan University with a Bachelor of Arts, 2 majors, International Political Science and French. He also holds a Juris Doctorate degree from McGeorge School of Law and a Master of Science of Strategic Intelligence from the National Intelligence University. And he is also a member of the California State Bar. He commissioned in 2002 after the attacks of 9/11, which occurred while he was in law school. Of his many accomplishments during his many years of service, and especially numerous deployments, one that he is most proud of is the setup of the Anti-Corruption Justice Center in Kabul, Afghanistan, which was a project that was sponsored by the Afghan president, and that was set up in 2016, and it was the maturation of roughly 4 years of work by Chad and his fellows to get that thing started, which is pretty awesome. He holds 5 military operational specialties. He is a Western European Foreign Area Officer, a Southeast Asian Regional Area Officer, a Joint Specialty Officer, an Advanced Foreign Security Force Advisor, and Judge Advocate. So if you don't believe me when I say he's a Renaissance man, listen to this. He also speaks Italian, French, and Pashto, in addition to English.
Wow.
Pretty awesome. I mean, this
Smart
guy,
dude.
smart dude.
Wow. All right. Well, this is an episode I've been looking forward to recording for quite some time here. I'll start off by saying a lot of people ask me what my story is, and Chad, it's a lot your story as well. Now we can talk about it. You were doing a lot of work over the last 5 years in the background, so I appreciate you coming on and finally able to tell your half of the story. But a lot of people want to know, like, Ryan, what happened in DIA? What happened when you were in the Defense Intelligence Agency? What took you from motivated officer to become president of a foundation that assists whistleblowers? And they really want to get into the nitty gritty of the Defense Intelligence Agency scandal that you and I were a part of and blew the whistle on. And I look forward to this episode not for recounting the specific nitty gritty events, because honestly, what started it was, I mean, nothing incredibly sexy. I think you probably find a lot of what we were confronting across the military, right? And it had an
Hmm.
element of intelligence community in it, and it had some palace intrigue stuff, but it wasn't incredibly astronomical, at least the event itself. But the reason why I'm so excited to talk about what happened and then what happened afterwards today is because I can talk about it. You know, for many years, the events played out really about 5 years ago now. For
Yeah.
many years, I couldn't even discuss it without clenching my fists or gritting my teeth. I spent a year in therapy after DIA. You know, it was tough stuff, and it's hard to articulate and it's hard to convey the PTSD you suffer
Hmm.
from something that happens within the walls of a cubicle, right? So you talk from an academic stance, outside looking in, it's like, okay, you're a victim of reprisal, you know, get on with life.
Hmm.
And it's just such a fundamental moral betrayal and moral injury that it takes a significant toll on your psyche. And Chad, you know, you and I have started a book, and God's honest truth, I
Yeah.
just couldn't bring myself to write because I didn't want to relive the events of DIA circa 2019. And so that's why I'm so happy today, because it's almost like a cathartic moment for me in that I can actually talk about it without punching something, no exaggeration. So, my friend, and I say that literally, my friend, it's good to have you on the show. And I look forward to some very candid discussion about the events 2019 and beyond. So, welcome aboard, shipmate.
Well, thanks, Ryan. No, it's great to see what you guys are doing with the foundation and this podcast in terms of putting this stuff out there because like you said, one of the most traumatic parts, I think, of going through the whistleblower process, right, which they tell you is your duty. I don't believe that many people actually mean that. That's my personal belief,
Clearly.
but
Yeah.
Hmm.
when you do that, when you endeavor to go down that road and airing stuff out that's not right, man, you are alone. I mean,
Hmm.
you are out on a raft by yourself, and maybe you're lucky enough, like you and I were, to have each other because, it happened to a number of people in our office in Rome. I was involved in your ongoing IG investigation, and then all of a sudden things started happening to me. And you're like, why is this happening? What is this about? Is this because I was a witness in an ongoing investigation, or is the eye of Sauron now, from DIA now on me because of
Hmm.
I don't know what? What did I do? And it literally took years to really kind of be able to step back and see most likely what had happened and where, you personally as a whistleblower come under scrutiny, especially when there's other things happening around you. And, if you don't have a good support system of, family backing you up at home, of colleagues that are, that you can talk to, it gets really lonely and really scary. I mean, it's your career, and
Yeah.
if you were in the attaché program like you and I were, I mean, that's one of the most selective programs in the Department of Defense. You're getting, a very, very high vis assignment. And for me, I was not used to being somebody who came under scrutiny, especially as a judge advocate. So yeah, I mean, the mental toll was huge. And just like you, I really couldn't keep writing the book. I didn't want to keep telling the story. I wanted to step away from it. And that's why I think it's huge and very commendable what, and I know both of you, Cheska, as well, have gone through the whistleblower process. It's being able to stay in engaged in this fight. It takes a toll. It's hard, very, very
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah. So good segue. Let's tee it up back to circa 2019. So you're in the office being the Defense Attaché office of Rome. And just for context, that's the Attaché service, a subordinate division within the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is the military brother of the CIA. So you and I are in Italy. We're doing the Attaché job. That's essentially liaison between Italian military and American military. We're working for the Defense Intelligence Agency, and we're there. And we're going through a lot of inner office struggles, especially we've got some senior officers who are toxic influences. They are not doing the job. They're not doing the job well. They're impeding others doing the job. We've got an enlisted member or two subverting the chain of command, also adding some toxic elements to it. The place is kind of a wreck, and the lead, the defense attaché, the head, is well outside his depth in terms of the position, just not suited to lead, not suited to lead a small, high-performing unit like a defense attaché office of 7 in a location abroad. So things come to a head. 2019, December, it was Christmas Day. I remember it very well. I sent a letter to Miss Tammy Levitt. Now, Miss Tammy Levitt exists in the hierarchy in a geographic division within the attaché service. So if you imagine here, you've got the Defense Intelligence Agency, a subordinate division. One of the operational divisions of that agency is the Defense Attaché Service. It's all these high-performing officers abroad in embassies serving in positions. And within the attaché service, you have multiple geographic divisions. Levitt was leading the European division. And I sent her a letter and I said, we have got some serious systemic problems in Rome that are not being addressed by our defense attaché and are impacting the mission. Now, for context here, over the previous 6 months leading up to this contact with headquarters, I had been consistently raising concerns with the defense attaché, i.e. the boss, regarding not only the toxic influences of our air attaché colleague, but also significant operationally related concerns, which I can't go into now due to classification. Suffice it to say, they were hampering our operation abroad significantly. And in what could only be described as a blatantly retributive move, the defense attaché changed my primary rater, i.e. the person who does my annual performance assessment, from himself to the air attaché, who was the very subject of my concerns and allegations, along with the allegations from several others. I implored him to reconsider that, since it was a relationship wrought with bias, but he did not, which was, I argue, indicative of his pernicious motivations as well. Ultimately, to the surprise of likely no one, I would later receive an annual performance report written by that toxic officer who was the subject of the allegations, that promotion board members labeled as placing me in, quote, the bottom quartile of the Air Force officer corps, end quote.
Wow.
At the same time in our office, circa 2019, we had one of our non-commissioned officers being harassed and bullied, as well as another attaché colleague being medically discriminated against, all with the defense attaché, aka commander, unable or unwilling to address any of it. So after 6 months of attempting to fix it at the lowest level, I said, enough is enough here. We need to get back to focusing on the mission, and we can't do it with all this BS afoot. And that's how really my whistleblower journey began, because that protected communication started a series of snowballing events which would years later culminate in legislation. And that's, I think, in and of itself very telling, that you have a a matter within an office that really was easily solved, right? It just took a little bit of leadership and a little bit of courage. And I am sure it would have been nipped in the bud, to use Scott Barrier's words, but it wasn't. It was doubled down with another wrong. And then we would go to the IG and they would sham the investigation. They would double down with another wrong, and on and on and on. DO, level of the Air Force, International Affairs, Undersecretariat, Congress, etc. And suddenly you and I are going to the House Intel Committee and we're getting laws passed so that DIA can fix itself, quite literally, without exaggeration. That is how that snowballed in a span of multiple years. So that's the context.
And I just want to highlight for our listeners. So normally when we're talking about these types of issues, or normally when people think about protected communication for the military, they're thinking, oh, I made a complaint to Congress, or I filed an IG complaint, or I filed an EO complaint. Ryan had not even filed a complaint. He literally sent an email at the lowest level to his boss and said, hey, we have some issues. And yet, still, because that was still a protected communication, all the things that happened after were reprisal, by the law, reprisal.
And so what happens is, and now I know the rest of the story because I've gotten the reports via the Freedom of Information Act years later, is that Miss Levitt flew out in January of 2020 on what she called a fact-finding mission. And within the first hour of that fact-finding mission, she pulled me aside and removed me from the follow-on assignment she had recommended just 3 weeks prior. Now, I thought that was reprisal. But then I learned in the investigation, the DIA IG investigation, which did not substantiate reprisal, that as a matter of fact, the day after I emailed her in December of 2019, she contacted the Undersecretary of Air Force International Affairs Division and had me removed from consideration. So I was reprised against even before I was reprised against. And that's where it began.
And so I got to jump in with this because that's the MO, right? Exposed, because
Yes.
the exact same thing happened to me literally the next day after I told the chain of command that essentially our office needed to be investigated for something. I was told by the same individual you're talking about, I needed to get my rear end on the next plane back to DC. And if you can imagine, like, think about getting that phone call, right? Like, as a service member, and you're an attaché, you're a diplomat, you're at a foreign post, your butt needs to be on the first flight back to DC. Like, my head was spinning because, my military superior is down the hallway. He hasn't said anything to me about this. I'm getting an order from a civilian, which isn't a thing. There's only a couple of civilians out there who can give military members orders, and it ain't the head of a geographic division inside a DIA. And then, the next day I would find out there was a memo signed returning to my board screened service nomination for a second attaché diplomatic assignment to Bogota, Colombia. It's the exact same pattern, right? Protected communication, and it's like, Queen of Hearts, off with your head immediately before, you get to the IG's office. And again, same thing. IG didn't substantiate my reprisal, even though it was the day after I made a protected communication. But as we would find out later on through really all the efforts that you made, Ryan, that was the MO. I mean, that's just what they would do. The second that you became a problem, and this is what I ultimately reported to the director of operations, Major General Schmidt, before kind of like my outbrief to DIA, was that anytime, somebody of competence, pierces the veil of incompetence within DIA, it's that immediate chain of events happens. That's off with their head. You're either removed from post. The IG's office actually told me that I was the first attaché that they had ever seen called back to DC and then returned to their post, that I actually made it back to my post. And I personally know that there were other attachés, even an SDO DAT, who was removed from post, separated from their family for months like this. And then after that, then begins the character assassination. They're going to bleed you out by 1,000 cuts that you never see coming, that happen back at DIA headquarters. You get demonized, you get the scarlet letter put on you, and that's their MO. and that's what they
Yeah.
did. You never know that though. You don't know it when it's happening. When you're a whistleblower, you have simply told your, in my world, I just told my chain of command, Houston, we got a problem. We got a problem here. It's undermining the mission, X, Y, and Z, some of the stuff I can't get into, for classification reasons. But next thing, then the hammer comes down on you. And you're trying to figure out why. How come I didn't hear this from the military chain of command? What's happening here? Is this because I was a witness in Ryan's ongoing investigation, which is what I thought for the longest time was the reason?
Yeah.
Because that you and I were having conversations that weekend about writing letters to the HIPSI and the SISI, and that's the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. And yeah, and then that event, when I was told, get back to DC, I asked the question, why? Like, what do I need a defense counsel? What am I being
Mhm.
recalled for? I was pointedly told, you don't need to know why. You just need to get on the plane.
Oh my God.
So in the sequence of events, I depart in August of 2020. So the
Yep.
the retributive hit squad shows up in Rome in January of 2020,
Yep.
removes me from my next assignment, removes one of our colleagues from his assignment period. In the
Hmm.
same period, has already basically derailed another one of our colleagues from future service in the agency.
Yep.
I begin the IG complaint process, which of
Yep.
course languishes for an eternity. I
Yep.
depart in August of 2020. Where are we
Yep.
at now in the timeline and what happens with you afterwards, Chad?
Yeah, so you left, and DAO Rome was weird. We'd go through periods of, hey, everything's good. And then all of a sudden you're getting talked to about like, hey, why did you raise, some random issue like, hey, we couldn't get issued tokens for the computers because that guy's on leave. Why'd you raise that as an issue? Like, well, it's an issue. You need to have somebody redundant to do that, but you would get like kind of almost counseled for trying to make the office a better place.
Mhm.
So you leave in August. And by the way, Ryan's not talking about this, but everybody's kind of turned their backs a little bit to him because we're in a joint environment, highly selective job, don't want to get the stink on us. I didn't really care about that because again, I'm a judge advocate and, for me, right's right. And Ryan had left certain relevant things for his investigation with me that he couldn't, take along for classification reasons. And so I was kind of like Ryan's witness for the IG investigation back in the office for providing these materials when it would come up in the investigation. So, going into spring, for me, it happened in, I think it was May of 2021 is when things came to a head for me. And it was, operationally related. And we were getting like really bad advice about what we couldn't do. I knew better. I had a master's degree in intelligence. I had operated a lot with intel in Afghanistan, and I knew the left and right limits of what you can do. I knew how to use foreign disclosure officers, so on and so forth. And so when it came up for me, his investigation was ongoing. I had recently provided the stuff that you had left for me to the IG investigator, and we're talking about writing Congress, but also simultaneously, I was experiencing friction, operational friction in the office, and that had come to a head. And I essentially had been told something I believed was intentionally false. And I said, look, we can't be telling falsities about national security information or the handling thereof. We need to investigate this office because I know what was just told to me was incorrect. And yeah, and that's when I was told, like, no kidding, less than an hour later, you got to be on a plane. But it was the Monday after we were talking about writing Congress. So, just throw my hands up in the air. I don't know which is which because it's not the military chain of command that I was dealing with about the operational friction. So you just don't know what's happening. And yeah, I ended up having to get a defense counsel, from the Marine Corps, which was really comforting getting like a third. That was the kind of the first time I got like a third person, objective perspective on what was happening to me. And when I had to go back into DIA, and again, this is the height of COVID, right? So I'm being ordered to, fly when you're not supposed to be flying, all the rest of that stuff.
Mhm.
Not told when I'm coming home, which is scary. I had a 3-year-old son who was hanging on my leg when I was like leaving my apartment in Rome. And, Daddy, when you coming home? It wasn't like a deployment. I couldn't tell him when
Hmm.
or even if, because I know that that had happened. People just didn't get to go home. And they will pack up your family like your knickknacks and get them to you months down the road, which again add to the stress of, going through the whistleblower process. Now you're going to separate me from my family too.
Hmm.
I get deployments. I understand deployments. I signed up for that. I didn't sign up for you using, my geographic location and my family against me. And so, yeah, I, walked into DI headquarters with a defense counsel, made it through it, got a letter of counseling that essentially detailed every time I had pointed out that the office wasn't functioning properly. Like actually part of that counseling was that I notified the administrative support that my embassy walkie-talkie wasn't working, and that was somehow like bad on me, like for flagging that. It was
That's
JV, it was
insane.
clown car.
That is so insane.
Yeah.
And they're doing that to a judge advocate as well.
I couldn't believe it, because the way that that stuff went down in DIA, for me was, I mean, it was so patently reprisal. I mean, to the
Hmm.
point where, as part of my IG complaint, my defense counsel wrote a letter detailing how it was like verbally the words that came out of people's mouths were, I mean, they were detailing that they were committing reprisal. And it was gross. And then same thing, I walk out of this. I was told by my service leadership within DIA, hey, listen, man, I got it. Nobody agrees with what's happening, but you're gonna have to come back here and you're gonna have to be humble about this if you want to get back and see your family.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And so that's what I did, you know. And then right after that counseling, I'm saying that with air quotes, I get handed a letter by the senior service rep saying, hey, from DIA that was dated the day after I made the complaint to protected communication in the office, that
Hmm.
even, and that memorandum was purported to be backdated 2 weeks before that, which, like, why are you putting that if you're not trying to hide the timeline of reprisal? And yeah, and then the day after the DIA meeting, I had to go meet with, Marine Corps leadership. And that was like night and day. I mean, that was one thing that I got, Ryan, that I don't think that you did get, which was, I mean, the Marine Corps, at least initially, really backed me up.
What we learned, Chad, is that, and this is one of the 70 witness statements or accounts I received over the course of the next 2 years. I want to read this one to you because it's going to sound awfully familiar. I'll leave the names out. In March 2020, when it emerged that a senior defense official would be returned to service, i.e., fired, they had expressed to a mutual friend that they had, quote, thought about ending it, end quote. Miss Levitt dispassionately summoned him back to DIA with little concern to the gravity of his mental state. Upon his arrival, escorts were tasked to take him to a behavioral health evaluation at Walter Reed, where he was not treated with any sensitivity. He was assigned a junior ranking officer as an escort and told by staff psychologists to go to behavioral health professionals, who immediately diverted them to the emergency room, where this officer in a fragile emotional state was poked and prodded by ER triage nurses. Levitt did not make the proper accommodations for his return and was escorted on a flight back to his country of service. After exhibiting suicidal ideations, he received outpatient treatment after COVID struck, all the while having been kept separate from his family for several months while tallying up an astronomical hotel bill. So, very similar modus operandi.
Yeah. And I can tell you it was difficult. I mean, I still get emotional thinking about it now, like again, you sign up for the deployments, you don't sign up for games like this. That was difficult. I think I initially had some good success by going to Congress because as soon as I got back to Rome, I rolled up my sleeves and went to work. I was just like, this cannot stand. I lined up courses of action. I mean, straight up like a detail, almost like a campaign plan. I'm
Hmm.
going to the HIPSY. This is how I got to do it. I'm going to the SISI. This is how I got to do it. And to do that, you have to go through your members of Congress, right? So I did get traction directly from the HIPSY. They had contact information out there and they reached back out to me because I coined this as a matter of urgent concern, right?
Hmm.
Because this was undermining our operations
Yep.
and immediately, started getting traction with them wanting to talk to me.
Okay, so let's keep the timeline on track. So you returned back to Rome in
Yep.
May of 2021, correct?
Yep.
And when do you start your endeavors to engage members or the committees of Congress?
Day one, literally the
Okay.
day I got off the plane, like next day, I went into the office. I started doing legal research about how to go about doing it, pulled up contacts, dug all the contact information for HIPSI, for SISI. So I had reached out to my senator, my junior senator, I'm from Michigan, Gary Peters' office. And if you remember this, this is where we got lucky and how small of a world this is. I had asked to speak with the chief of staff for Senator Peters' office because this was in my mind a matter of urgent concern. When I was taking my wife on the vacation that we were supposed to have when I was recalled to DC for Mother's Day to Montepulciano,
Mhm.
we were driving up there and I get a call from one of Senator Peters' staffers who explains to me that he's a reserve Army Sergeant Major and if I'd be willing to talk to him. And I said, look, you're a Sergeant Major, you're going to understand everything I'm talking about. Sure. So I start telling the story. And then I mentioned Tammy Levitt, and he stops dead in his tracks and goes, who?
He starts cussing.
Would no, he just says, like, was she like Army Intel? And I said, yeah, as a matter of fact, she was. And he goes, she was my platoon sergeant. All of this makes perfect sense now. And I'm not joking. He sends me an article written by one of her junior soldiers detailing all of this stuff. And because he, kind of knew her MO, he took personal interest in, for the next several months from May of 2021 all the way through that fall. I mean, there was a lot of activity in July on that. I remember I spoke in a classified forum with the HIPSI on multiple occasions. Got really lucky there too. Again, how a small world of connections helps. That I knew somebody who was former OGC from CIA who is now working for the HIPSI that I had worked with in a past life. I think that helped that there were just like these personal interests, personal connections from the organizations who were meant to, that I was supposed to report to, blow the whistle to, that I think helped. And yeah, over the next year, cooperated as needs be.
Let's catch it up because there's a critical juncture in June of 2021 and a day I doubt I will ever forget. You had been recalled to DC. You're back in Rome now. I'm a staff officer at Langley, Virginia. My IG complaint is now in, we'll say, month nine. I think it's on the third investigator who's called me and said, what's going on here? Catch me up. This is
Oh
the
my
Defense
God.
Intelligence Agency, IG, sham of an investigation that they ultimately take 450 days to not substantiate what clearly was reprisal. And I'm getting frustrated because I'm getting stonewalled, and I can state that as a matter of fact. And I go to Chad, I go, you know what? What the fuck? Why not? I got nothing to lose. I'm gonna email everyone in the Defense Attaché service, and I'm gonna ask them if they're seeing what I'm seeing. I'm going to ask them if they're seeing dereliction of duty, toxic work environment, discrimination, and an IG office that is allowing it to happen. And I sent that in June of 2021. And within a matter of minutes, literal minutes, I receive a phone call from an unlisted number. And the gentleman on the phone starts the call off by going, you don't know me, but I know you. And I can tell you that on this date, there was a climate assessment done, and the results were abhorrent, and the director covered it all up. The director of the Defense Attaché service at the time, Michael Bachna. And that's what he told me. And I said, I am on it. He goes, you need to request that survey and get it through the Freedom of Information Act because it is very telling, as was the leadership's reaction to that climate assessment, which was to try and bury it. Mm-hmm. That was a pivotal point because fast forward, I somehow get a FOIA request, which was a miracle in of itself. And sure enough, it's atrocious. It's like 33% say they've been bullied. Half have been said they were discriminated against. Everybody says it's a toxic work environment, all coming out of the Defense Attaché service. And that was the tipping point to convince two people who were working on the Wall Street Journal story at the time. And I know this is getting ahead of the sequence here, but it was a pivotal moment because that report was what pushed the story over the edge and got it into the national press in February of 2022. That all started with that phone call in June of 2021. I remember it clearly. And I remember the speed at which I received the anonymous tip because it changed the direction of everything after that. After that, I had multiple witnesses, 70 in total, come forward. We got the story in the national press. We finally had our narrative, the truth, which was countering the perverted narrative that the agency had been spinning about us and what had been happening over the last year. And this was a pivotal turning point and where things really began to happen. But changing an organization's culture doesn't happen overnight, and although we began to make progress, there were still many growing pains within the agency to include reprisal, retaliation, violations of the law, and perhaps worst of all, the meddling in the Afghanistan evacuation operation of 2021. But to hear about that and more, please tune in to the next episode. Until then, bye.
Bye. Well, that's it for this week's topic. We really appreciate you tuning in. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and check out our foundation website at walkthetalkfoundation.org.
And feel free to reach out and give us feedback. You can get a hold of us via Facebook, X, Instagram, LinkedIn, and our foundation's website. Details in the description section. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next episode.